The story of the patriarch Joseph ends the book of Genesis. Like Joseph's family before him, the families of Abraham and Sarah, Isaac and Rebekah, and Jacob and Rachel, Joseph's story shows a dysfunctional family who works out its petty jealousies in terrible ways. It's also a story which shows how, with God's help, one can transcend such dysfunction and end up being used by God in kind of miraculous ways. In the story, Joseph finds himself in terrible situations. He's thrown in a pit and left for dead. He's sold into slavery. He's falsely accused of sexual assault and jailed. But at the end of the story, he's the second most important person in Egypt, and he's responsible for an entire region of the world getting through a major famine. He goes about as low as one can get, but then he rises above it all. In this way, it's a story of faith in the midst of terrible tribulation. It's a story which shows that the light indeed shines in the darkness, that hope does indeed eclipse despair, that life triumphs over death. It's also a story with a function. It's a bridge from the tales of the patriarchs to the story of the Exodus. In order for the Israelites to be in Egypt, to be led out of it, they had to get there in the first place. The story of Joseph ends with the Israelites in Egypt, ready to be eventually be delivered out of it again. Amazingly, it's a story that echoes so many other stories of the ancient Near East, stories that you have probably never heard of, stories that are not in the Bible, but that Israel's neighbors to the north, south, east, and west would have been intimately familiar with. Exploring these similarities, we find both the threads which held ancient Semitic peoples together, and exploring the differences between the stories shows the uniqueness of the story of Joseph itself. It's also a story that has politics written all over it. Remember that Jacob's 12 sons eventually become the titular heads of the 12 tribes of Israel. Some of the politics that defined the relationships between those nations are played out in the story of Joseph and his brothers, which helps us figure out some things about when and where the story was written, and that is fascinating. And there are some incredible linkages between the story of Joseph the patriarch and Joseph the husband of Mary. The two Josephs lived almost 2,000 years apart, but their stories echo each other in some subtle ways, which can help us better understand Joseph, Jesus' adopted father, and which put the story of Jesus' birth in a different context. So that's what we're going to get into in this course. If you're excited for that, I would suggest reading the story for yourself. Genesis 37 through 50 contains the story of Joseph. You'll notice some interludes where the story of Joseph seems to stop and then it picks up a little bit later, and those interludes are important too. We'll spend some time going through the story itself, scene by scene, but if you read it on your own, you'll come with a fuller understanding, and perhaps you'll even bring some questions you wouldn't have thought of otherwise.